Okay, so let's get started. First of all, thank you so much. So we're very excited to kick this year off with less waste. This is a time that many of us are working to change aspects of our lifestyle and grow in the process. So I'm very excited to see that many of you, like us, are looking how to reduce waste, specifically at home. And so that brings us to our Home Waste Audit, which is a community science project designed to help increase your waste literacy, while at the same time looking for ways to reduce our own waste. So what will happen tonight is we'll have a short presentation that covers who we are, a bit more about plastic pollution overall, and of course, we're going to walk you through all of the instructions for the next 2 weeks of the home waste audit. But before we do that, we want to get to know each other a little bit better and acknowledge the land upon which we're doing our local work. So my name is Susan and I'm joined by Chelsea. In my role, I lead our volunteer and community programming. And for me, my personal resolution, which I must confess is one that I've had for many years, is to focus more on home cooked meals. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea briefly to introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea. I'll be talking a lot more later, but I lead a lot of our scientific programming and our solutions-based research. And I decided this year my New Year's resolution would be to read more beyond the news. I read a lot of news, and I want to try to read more books.
If you haven't already introduced where you're from, you can continue to share where you are in the chat. We want to learn a little bit more about you, and this also is a really interesting way to see the scope of this year's home waste audit. So before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the history of the lands we call home. And as we've seen, we are thrilled to have people joining us from all over, and we extend our acknowledgements to the Indigenous and traditional past across all territories. For our team, we'll speak to the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And now a bit more about us, the U of T Trash Team. We formed in 2017 in collaboration with the Rockman Lab at the University of Toronto, and we are a science-based community outreach organization. Our shared goal is to increase waste literacy as a way to reduce plastic pollution. And all of this work is supported by our dynamic team of volunteers and students and early career researchers. And I'm happy to welcome those who are joining us tonight. And the way we do this work is through three main work streams, which are community outreach, education, and solutions-based research. And to sum all of that up, we have our theory of change, which illustrates how scientific evidence provides the foundation for this work. And through those three connected work streams, our work is local to build collaborations globally as a way to reduce plastic pollution. And this work could not be done without the energy of our volunteers who help make it possible to achieve these goals related to all sorts of great things such as policy, healthy ecosystems, and engaged communities. And I'm seeing a lot of conversations in the chat, so I'm actually looking forward to catching up on what's being shared. So let's dive into the reason we're all here tonight, which is the home waste audit. This is a community science project, and it's going to be designed to help each of us change our own personal habits to help protect the planet. We have two main objectives. The first is to get a deeper learning and understanding about the different waste systems in our own municipalities. From the introductions earlier, you'll notice we'll already learn about more than just Toronto. And our second objective is ultimately to work with our new knowledge to decrease our waste footprint and divert waste from landfills. So tonight we're going to go through all the instructions on how to collect this data, so don't worry. And that data is going to be used to help us see how diverse our waste streams are, and also have a look at any behavior changes. And that'll all take place in the second webinar. And don't worry, as you're collecting this information, it's all going to be kept anonymous, so you can track your waste habits without any worry. And before I turn it over to Chelsea, I just wanted to cover how the Q&A will work. As has been encouraged, if you have questions, as you have been doing and communicating, continue to use those in the chat. We'll try to answer them as we go, or we'll save them towards the end. And when that happens, and we'll go over this again, you'll either have a chance to ask your question on the microphone out loud or type it in the chat. We'll go back and forth. So I'm now going to turn it over to Chelsea, and she'll give us a global context to the issue and, of course, share what we're all here for, more instructions about your home waste audit. So go ahead, Chelsea.
Thank you, Susan. And before I get started, I just want to comment on Christina Hill in the chat. We're thrilled you're from somewhere else. Obviously, we love to have people here from Toronto, but we also hope to have a sprinkling of people from elsewhere because it makes the data more interesting, which you'll see in 2 weeks. So thank you for being here. So before I begin talking about a little bit more about plastic pollution, I just want to pause for a moment and have everyone take a look around the room that you're sitting in and reflect on how many items you see in that room that are made out of plastic. So for example, there's plastic in the laptop I'm talking to you on, and I can see it in the phone sitting next to me. I'm curious whether or not you're taking notes on a pen made of plastic. Are you potentially sitting in a plastic chair? I am. And I suspect most of you have noted several plastic items in the room that you are in other than those that I've named. And so that's really just to point out the fact that plastic is really everywhere. And we're not really here to tell you that this is necessarily a bad material, but we're here to talk about how it becomes waste and how we can reduce some of that waste for those items that tend to become waste quite quickly. So there are some obvious reasons why plastics have become something we use every day. Plastic is cheap, it's fast to produce compared to other natural materials. It's really lightweight in comparison to glass or other containers, and that means it can save on energy when it's being shipped around the world. If it's heavier, it means more gas. So by reducing the weight, you can reduce the amount of fossil fuels you're using through gas, although of course plastics are made out of fossil fuels. Plastics are also really durable, and they can be manufactured to be extremely rigid, flexible, or heat resistant. And so because many of it has so many different forms, plastic is this really unique material with some really valuable functionings. And so you may notice it's often used for really important things like medicine, for safety and protection, also for transportation, and of course, for communication. However, plastic is now used so much that people cannot go one day or even a couple hours without using something made of plastic. So although there are clearly valuable uses for it, like the single-use, there are also many plastics that are not necessary. In particular, single-use items like the single-use plastic water bottles, bags, and cutlery that you can see in this picture. These items are often used for a short period of time, and then they are discarded. And because many of them are made from non-recyclable plastics and they cannot be recycled, that means they end up in the landfill, or sometimes we find them as litter in the environment. The rise of plastic production has been quite significant over the years, and part of this is due to that high demand and high consumption. Since the 1950s, plastic production has increased exponentially. By 2017, we had produced approximately 8.3 billion tons of virgin plastics. So here you can see this rise over time, and you can see here for the black all of the waste that was generated and also projecting out into 2050. And you can see based on our predictions, we think that the amount of plastic that we use is predicted actually to double or more than double by 2050. And one of the things that's notable is that production is getting faster every year. And in fact, the production of plastic is starting to outpace the production or the availability of our waste management, even in parts of the world that are developed, considering here in Canada. So we are simply producing too much plastic to deal with. And our plastic consumption habit has outpaced waste management systems, as I said. This means a huge amount of plastic waste escaping our waste systems and reaching the environment. So you may have previously heard the estimate that 8 million tons of plastic waste enters our oceans every year. In fact, that was the statistic of the year in, I believe, 2016. Today, we estimate that that number is more than 23 million tons of plastic that's entering aquatic ecosystems every year. And so that includes more than just the ocean. And even with all of the current efforts to reduce plastic pollution happening around the world, if we keep producing and using plastic at the current rate that we do, this number could reach up to 90 million tons entering our aquatic ecosystems by the year 2030, which is really just 5 years away. So the problem with plastic pollution is that it takes an extremely long time to break down. And even then, it doesn't disappear completely. So every piece of plastic that has ever been made likely still exists in some form, but likely in really smaller fragments called microplastics. And because it doesn't really ever fully go away, or at least not on a time scale we can really imagine. Plastic persists and accumulates in the environment, and we find it everywhere. And plastic pollution is more than just an eyesore. It threatens the health and survival of wildlife through entanglement, ingestion, and the chemicals associated with the plastics, which are both the additives that they use in manufacturing, but also those chemicals from the environment that accumulate on the plastic. So now let's take a little break for a poll question to kind of think about our waste management system. So I told you that right now our amount of plastic that we're producing is outpacing the amount that we can manage. But I'm curious if you want to take a guess, what percent, someone's already guessing, what percent of all the plastic ever made globally do you think has been recycled? So yes, you can answer in the chat. Is it 1%? Is it 9%? Is it 27%? Or is it about half? 50%. And this is the global number. And I'm looking in the chat right now and I see a lot of pessimism. We've got a 9% and quite a few 1%. And I will say that that pessimism is not totally wrong. The answer is 9%, and that is the global number. Now, just for fun, does anyone think Canada is higher than that, or lower than that, or the same as that? So for our country, our current number is, we think, about 11%. So slightly higher than that. So most plastic doesn't get recycled. So in addition to needing more waste management, we also need better waste management to truly build that circular economy. Okay. So of all the plastic waste that has ever been produced, 79% has ended up in landfills or the environment. To give you a bit more of this picture, 12% has been incinerated and only 9% has been recycled. And for that incineration number, some of that is to energy and some of that is just simply incinerated. The recycle rate, for example, in the United States is lower than that 9% number. Right now, they think it's about 5%. And much of the waste that ends up in landfills is avoidable, as approximately 40% of the plastic produced every year is single-use packaging, used just once and then discarded. And some people talk about whether or not recycling can be the answer to the problem. It is true that recycling alone will not solve our plastic pollution problem, but we do think that it definitely helps. Plastic cannot be recycled infinitely, but every item that is recycled reduces the amount of energy required to make a new item. Plastic is made from oil, which is a fossil fuel. So by reducing oil demands for plastic production, recycling also reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And importantly, recycling contributes to the diversion of waste from landfill. Sending waste to landfill should be the final option after refusing, reducing, reusing, and then recycling. By using something once and throwing it in a landfill, this encourages continued consumption of fossil fuels and the creation of new products. Landfill space is finite, and eventually we will run out, and so we must prioritize alternative ways to deal with our waste. The waste in landfills can also contaminate groundwaters and contribute to air pollution and as the waste decomposes. Not all landfills are perfectly engineered and contained, and often landfill is not the final endpoint for plastic waste. When waste leaks out of this landfill, it pollutes surrounding environments. And we actually very recently just measured the amount of microplastic in landfill leachate, and unfortunately, we did find microplastics in that leachate. So landfill, yes, keeps it out of the environment in many ways, but it's definitely not where we want to be sending all of our waste. So what can we do about it? Well, on an individual level, there are three main ways we think we can really tackle this problem of plastic pollution in the environment. One is reducing consumption by using less plastic and not contributing to the need for increased production. Number two is improving waste management at home, as well as in our local areas. That can be improving our own waste management, making sure we're doing it right, but also the city increasing or improving their waste management. And number three is cleaning up pollution from the environment itself. For the home waste audit, we're really going to mostly focus on 1 and 2. And we, the U of T trash team, strongly believe in the power of the individual. Even small changes you make on an everyday basis can make a huge difference. For example, in Canada, We produce approximately 3.3 million tons of plastic waste per year. 85% of this goes to landfill, and much of this waste is single-use plastic, which can be avoided by each of us making smarter decisions about the items we purchase and use on a weekly basis. So that's why it's so important, we think, to know before you throw and learn which items can go in which bin according to your local guidelines. We've all had that moment, all of us, when we're not sure if something should go in the recycle bin or not. In this situation, some people choose to wish cycle, to throw those items in the recycle bin in the hope that they will get recycled anyway. But in reality, this can lead to complications at the recycling center, making it less likely that the stuff that should be recycled will get recycled. In Canada, upwards of 25% of the waste put in recycling bins is rendered non-recyclable by contamination, and these non-recyclable items are then mixed in with the recyclables, which can sometimes make the entire bin go to landfill. So it's really important to think about what we buy in terms of reducing our waste, but also knowing the best way to keep it in a circular economy by recycling correctly. So with that said, we also know that recycling can be confusing. How to recycle correctly varies city by city. Recycling guidelines really differ between countries, between states, between provinces, and like I said, actually sometimes truly by cities. So for those of you here in Toronto, our rules are slightly different than the region of Peel, which is really not very far away. And a lot of this is due to differences in the recycling facility as well as the markets that they can take. So this kind of controls what they can and can't process in each location. Some materials recovery facilities or MRFs are more advanced and are able to process mixed materials, whereas others can only process certain types of plastics. In an ideal world, recycling guidelines would be harmonized to make it much easier on us to do the right thing. But this system only works if everyone involved follows the guidelines. And I think with some of the federal policies and provincial policies, people are trying to harmonize these, but at the moment we don't have harmonization across all of our cities. So on this note, this likely brings us into our home waste audit, where we're going to spend the next 2 weeks kind of thinking about the waste we produce and how we can individually manage it. Okay. So now I'll move into the instructions on the home waste audit. And if you have any questions about both the introduction as well as the home waste audit, we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So Monday will begin your personal home waste audit, which you will undertake for a total of 2 weeks. This audit includes 3 overarching tasks. 1 is webinars, one of which is today. 2 is the actual audit, which means literally counting and characterizing your waste. So that's your data collection. And number 3 is the online surveys to guide increased waste literacy or better understanding of the system. So hopefully you've already completed survey 1. And by the end of this webinar, you'll only have one more webinar, or you only have one more survey left, as well as one more webinar left. And for this project, all you need is a piece of paper, a pencil, and your computer. If you don't want to print the data sheets, you can make your own data sheets on a piece of scrap paper, as long as you keep all the same prompts, and eventually later transcribe or type your answers into the data sheet online. You will be receiving all of the links to the surveys, the data sheets, and other resources you need via emails from Eventbrite. And if anything is ever unclear, you can always email us and we will respond. And we promise you we will not be cluttering your inbox, and we will be very careful to only send you what you need to reduce, of course, your email waste. So now I'm going to carefully go through the instructions 1 week at a time, but if I miss something or it is not clear, please feel free to ask a question. Okay, so here we go. So this week will start Monday, which is February 10th. And as I said earlier, if you haven't completed the entrance survey, please fill it out before you begin. You can find that link in your Eventbrite emails, and Susan will also share it in the chat. It's important that you do the webinars when the surveys when prompted for the surveys, because one gives us data, and the other one is actually part of the waste literacy process to guide the second week of the waste audit, which is where you're trying to actively reduce your waste. So your task now is to attend webinar 1. You're here, or watch it online if you're planning to watch the recording. And then, of course, taking the entrance survey. So during week 1, it is very important that you continue business as usual. This week we consider is your baseline for which you will compare your other weeks to. In order to properly measure our baselines and how our increased knowledge and changed behaviors reduce our waste, we must not change our behaviors yet. So please just do next week the way you would normally do next week. To prepare, I suggest printing or preparing your data sheets and having the instructional guide printed or up on your home screen to follow along during this 2-week period. For me, I decided to log my waste weekly when I did the home waste audit on our first year several years ago. And what I would do is I would log it at the end of the week. So I would literally sit on the ground and dump out my garbage, and I would tally all of the things that I had thrown away that week on paper and then put them on the data sheet later. Over this 7-day period, what you're going to do is count and characterize the waste you produce in your landfill bin and your recycling bin. You are not going to focus on your green bin. And you're going to record the count and the category of each item you throw away. I'll show you an example of the data sheet in a second. All of the links for everything, as I said, will be in your Eventbrite emails, but we'll also share them in the chat right now as well. So this means at the end of each week, say on a Sunday for me, but you can do this as you want. You can take data as you throw. I would collect all of the different waste bins on my house. So here I'm showing you my garbage. And I would collect all of the ones that would go to landfill, and I would combine them into one bin. And as I said, I would dump them onto the ground, and I would literally audit my waste. If you do not want to do this every time you throw something away, you can certainly note it as you go. Okay, so the data will eventually go here on a data sheet that looks like this. Here you can see it's all transcribed for you, so you can get an idea of what it will look like. And so just a few things to note. And I'm actually going to flip to an actual data sheet so you can see it. So this information is important, especially the city and where you are, because it's interesting to know how your waste compares to others based on your rules about what goes into landfill, what goes into recycling. Then there's this question of the number of people in the house. This should be the people that are relevant to the waste audit. So for example, you probably control the waste of your pet, but if you live with a roommate and they refuse to try to make a difference in the second week, you probably want to hoard your own garbage for this 2-week period. But if your roommate's willing to collaborate with you, then you would put the 2 people there and include your roommate in the audit. So be mindful of that. You note your start date and any notes. So for example, if I throw a birthday party for my kid that week and I've made so much more garbage than normal, I would want to note that down because that may not be a normal week. Now, we used to run the home waste audit for 4 weeks. Now we only run it for 2 weeks. If you have a big event like that, it might make it hard to compare the 2 weeks. So you actually might want to consider shifting your weeks. But then, of course, in terms of when our data is due, that means your data might not be included in the overall, but you can still see your data in general. Then the way that we record the data is you're going to split it up by overarching type of material: plastic, paper, metal, glass, and mixed material. I'll talk about what some of these different materials are in a little bit. And then you have other, but we have not pre-filled in these categories for you. I mean, I have here because I'm showing you as if I had filled it out, but it's going to be blank. So you're going to have to kind of create these categories yourself. If you have like a bunch of little pieces of paper, consider it like that you've ripped up, consider it one piece of paper. Don't include dust, don't include hair. So certain things, like kind of think critically, I guess, about the items that you choose and use common sense about how you do them. Like if you don't necessarily need to record by color. Here we haven't done it by brand, we just do drink bottle. This way it's easier to kind of look at how items will vary across houses if they're in more of these broader categories. As you load data, graphs will be produced. So you're going to see your data go onto graphs as you do it. There's separate pages for landfill, for recycling, and for each week. And you'll have a data summary being populated as you go. So your data will be accessible to you immediately, as you put it into the spreadsheet. Okay, so before I move on from here, I just want to do a little bit of a quiz for some of the items that I think are tough to think about what category you would put them in, whether it's plastic, whether it's other, whether it's mixed, etc. So I'm going to name an item, and I want you to write in the chat whether it's plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other. So the first item is styrofoam. Would styrofoam go in plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other? We have people immediately writing plastic. That's great. That is the answer. Number 2 is floss. Is floss typically, I'm going to write floss here to separate it. Is it typically plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other? And I say typically because you can buy floss made out of alternative materials. I think it is typically plastic, but of course you can buy like a cellulosic with a wax. So think about what your floss is. But typically, like if you're using Glide, it is a plastic material. The next one is a compostable plastic cup. Is that plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other? Compostable plastic cup. Plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other. So there's one, so Brent says paper if it's compostable. And in this case, I'm talking about like a paper cup, or sorry, a plastic cup that's like it's usually polylactic acid, but the actual plastic one. In that case, that's plastic. If you have a paper cup that says compostable, that actually would be mixed, because within a paper cup, often there's a plastic lining on the inside, for example, like a coffee cup. So a coffee cup, for example, would actually be a mixed material, like a disposable paper coffee cup. Okay, next one is cigarette butts. What is a cigarette butt? Is it plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other? I'm getting a lot of plastic and mixed. That's great. It is mixed because it has plastic in there and paper around it. And a lot of people don't know cigarette butts are made out of plastic. So that's awesome. You guys did really well. Another one I'll ask is like one of those silver chip packages or like a granola bar wrapper that looks silver. Is that plastic, paper, metal, glass, mixed, or other? See a lot of plastic. Oftentimes it's plastic, even though it kind of looks like aluminum. Oftentimes those chip bags are plastic. The final one I'll ask about is a Tetra Pak. A Tetra Pak is like those kind of rectangular milk cartons or sometimes other juices. And I'm seeing a lot of mixed, and that's right, it is a mixed material. So when you're thinking about these items, just do think about what category it falls in. And obviously it's okay if you make mistakes. Okay, awesome. Okay, so next I do the same thing for my recycle bin, and here I only have one bin. So there again, you get to look at my waste. And again, just a reminder to note, we are not measuring organic. So if you have a green bin, if you live in a city that has compost or you compost on your own, awesome. But we're not going to ask you to go through that disgusting mix of materials. So you're off the hook on compost. All right. So now you're going to take some time for a bit of self-reflection and hear from each other. So as you think about your upcoming home waste audit, what do you think your most common waste item is going to be? So if you just think about your normal week, what do you think you throw away a lot of? And I can tell you, when I first did the home waste audit, I had ideas of what it would be, and I was wrong. And when I saw what it was, I actually reduced that item in my life. Okay, I see pop cans, I see paper towels, plastic food wraps, bread bags, a lot of food packaging, which does usually tend to be one of the highest ones. Yeah, awesome. So keep that in mind, because you'll see what it is and maybe you'll be surprised. I won't tell you what mine is yet, because I'll end up telling you later. Okay, and then when you come to the end of week 1, you will complete a survey, and survey 2 is really, really important. So please make sure you do that before you start week 2. And this one in particular is going to ask you a lot of questions about your local recycling and waste management stream. So after the survey, you'll be done with the surveys and you'll move on to week 2, which is no different than week 1, except for during week 2, now you're going to try to begin to reduce your waste by following the steps in the waste or the solutions hierarchy. For example, thinking about the materials you can refuse or reduce, but also thinking about the items you can recycle. For example, in some cities, you can't recycle black plastic. So if certain food items are sold in black plastic, but they're also sold in other colors, if you chose a container of another color, you're actually reducing your landfill waste and moving it to the recycling. So think about the ways in which you can reduce the amount of material that goes into landfill, and then of course also the amount that goes into the recycle, because you can start with these and then come to here. Some of you will see both of your waste streams go down. Some of you will see this one go down and this one go up, and that's okay too. The other thing that's really important, when you complete week 2, you will organize your data sheets. You'll make sure all your data is typed into the forms, and you have to send them to us. Earlier in the night, I caught myself saying your form online. The form is not online. The form will come to you via the internet, but then you have to send it back to us. Then we synthesize all the data and put it together, and it will all be anonymized when we show it in the second webinar. So please send us your data to our email. You'll get emails about this by February 26th, so we can tabulate and synthesize all the results. Okay. And finally, before I hand it back to Susan, I just want to say that there is a lot of information out there about how you can reduce your waste. There's a lot of information online, and sometimes it can feel like drinking from a fire hose. And we also want to say that we know that change is hard, and for that, baby steps are okay. So we don't expect to see huge changes within a 2-week period, but if you consider these behaviors over time, you will probably see large changes in a longer period. So you can find a lot of information about how to reduce your waste on the internet, as I said, but if you'd rather not surf the web and drink from the fire hose, over the years, as we've been doing the Home Waste Audit, we have kept and created a lot of tips for reducing your waste, and a lot of those are on our website, as well as often we'll share quite a bit on social media. So you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find those tips during the waste audit. If you ever want to share a tip and hope we'll add it to our website or share it on social media, please feel free to send it to us or put it on social media and tag us. And we'd love to see the creative things that you are doing. I thought I shared a slide of what I did, but maybe it comes up in webinar 2. But one of the things I noticed in my bin was a lot of junk mail. And I simply just put a sign on my mailbox that said, "No junk mail, please." And it stops coming. It was amazing. But don't do it during week 1. If you don't already, you could do it during week 2. All right. And with that, I'll pass it over to Susan.
Awesome. So before we wrap up and open up for questions, and a few of you had questions earlier that I've noted, so we'll get to those. We just want to remind everyone that you can do this. You've got this. And I said it's all anonymous information, so no one's going to be placing any judgment on how much or how little waste you're reporting. The goal is to learn and make these small changes. So we're hoping with this new knowledge, we can all then continue our journey and share with others as well to pass all of our tips onwards. And we're going to be covering all of that great information in the second webinar. So once all the data is analyzed, we really look forward for having you joining us for that second one in March. So just go on to the next slide. And then just wanted to remind you, once you've sent that data for us, then it's on to us and it's your turn to take a break. Sit back, relax, put your feet up, and then we're going to get to work analyzing. We're going to make all sorts of pretty graphs, and we'll host our webinar on March 13th. It's the exact same link today, same time, 7 p.m. Eastern. And we really strongly encourage you to join. We'll actually be asking a few questions during this webinar, which will also be used as information to inform all of the impacts of the waste audit. So it's also very important, as much as possible, if you can join, to come there. So I think now it's time for Q&A. Anything you've just heard about from the earlier conversation about plastic pollution, waste, or of course the instructions, we want to make sure that's all clear. And we did share our email. You can also ask us throughout the waste audit if you forget something or want to clarify, please reach out. But what we'll do for the I'm just going to add Chelsea to the Q&A as well, because we'll both answer your questions. If you want to ask something out loud, just use the raise hand feature and we'll call your name. If you hear your name, you can take yourself off mute, ask your question, and then we'll also go to questions in the chat. Now, before we get to, I see Safia, I see your hand raised, so you'll go first. I wrote down 2 questions. I'm going to throw to Chelsea in case we have the answer. I can't guarantee we do, but the first question, Chelsea, came from Chris when you were talking about the percentage of recycling. I think that's what inspired the question. Chris, if this is not correct, please clarify in the chat. You were asking about the percentage in landfills versus in water systems. So I'm not exactly sure specifically which percentage, but maybe Chelsea, you can speak to if we know of any difference in percent of waste in landfills versus aquatic systems.
I don't think I know the percent in wasteful versus aquatic ecosystems, but basically of all of the plastic we produce in the world since we started really producing through 2015, about half or more than half of that material either goes in landfill or goes in the environment. And while we don't really know how much goes into each, especially because landfill is a bit tough in that landfill can be like a roadside dump to a really engineered landfill, which does do a better job at containing the material. But we do predict that quite an awful lot of plastic goes into the environment every year, as you see. And yeah, Chris, I'm not considering landfills the environment, but so this is where it's tricky. Like if I go to a place where they don't necessarily have a highly engineered landfill, I would consider that dump, for example, the environment. But where it's a really contained, highly engineered landfill, which are common in Canada and the South, then I would not consider it the environment, although of course you could argue animals even live there. Seabirds, for example, sometimes find their way there to feed. But at the moment, yes, I'm not considering that the environment. We find, and I also wasn't sure, Chris, if you were talking about wastewater treatment plants. We do have a lot of plastic that goes through those systems. It's treated and that a lot of it will go into the sludge, but sometimes that sludge is then spread onto fields as like recycled biosolids. And so that's another conversation of how do we deal with the fact that there's contaminants in these that sometimes go out into the environment.
Yeah.
And yeah, Chris, you're right. So we do certainly, this is why landfill is one of the last things you want to do on that solutions hierarchy, because not only do we run out of space for landfill, but in order to create landfill, we have land use changes, and land use change is probably the worst environmental issue out there. Even though we spent a lot of time talking about climate change and plastic pollution, land use change for people, for how we live, agriculture, urban uses, etc., it does do the most harm to our environment. So Chris, thank you. That's a very thorough and broad question, and that's a lot of the stuff I talk about in one of my classes that I teach actually at U of T.
Yeah, and Chris, I remember you noted that you're up and you're in the Yukon, so I know your situation is different when it comes to landfill. So that's a very appropriate question. Maybe so Christina, I have your question about waste to energy, but I'm going to go to Safia because she's been waiting a bit with her hand up. If you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question, and we'll go back to, I see your question as well, Brent and Beth.
Okay, thank you so much and welcome. My name is Sophia. I am the community lead of Thankleaf Wellness Cafe Group, and it is now Climate Change Wellness Cafe. So I am working on the waste and green bins and recycling since 2018 in my community. So the short question is that I want that the sheet you send, or I got it from the website. Will you please send it in the PDF?
Oh, you're asking for the data sheet in a PDF format?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can, I'll make a note to add a PDF version. The reason why it is in an Excel version is we don't have a PDF version that you can fill out, but if you plan to print it, I guess you could scan it and then we could transpose it. I'm just thinking out loud about that. What would be the best for our data analysis?
If you want
No,
to take a picture of it and send it to us, we can absolutely transcribe it for you.
no, I was not able. I am not actually. I am not good in computer and not the expert, just like you guys. But I tried in Excel. I am not sure I will be able to print
Perfect.
because
Yeah,
whatever I saw, we have to write in it. But I would like the PDF by myself, and I also want to give it to other people for
No
my.
problem.
yeah,
Yeah,
we'll send it to you directly. And
yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
Christina had asked a question earlier. And we might not have the answer to this, Christina. Curious about the breakdown of incinerated waste to energy and just incinerated. So lots of interest in landfill questions.
Yeah. Yeah. So incinerated to energy. So you'll see around the world, everywhere around the world has differences in their waste management system. And actually, Chris, when you were asking me questions, I didn't realize you were from the Yukon, and I think your landfill system is even different. And I've been to the one in Iqaluit as well, which is also different. And so for incineration, for example, in Ontario, we have a waste to energy facility. It's not very big, but it does power some like 10,000 homes. And so that's waste to energy in terms of incineration to energy. Some people consider that a form of recycling, but it's not the same place as recycling on the waste hierarchy. But in other places where, say, they don't have landfill, they don't have a place to put their waste, they will burn their waste. So I was in Indonesia doing a lot of research, gosh, now maybe 10 years ago. And there, a lot of waste is simply burned, sometimes in people's backyards, which can be hazardous to people's health, but they're not necessarily aware because the plastics, when burned, can reduce or can emit toxic chemicals. But in the past, before plastic, when we're burning, banana leaves or even just paper, it wasn't as big of a deal. But with so much plastic now, so much of that waste we're burning is plastic, and that can send up microplastics and other chemicals into the air. So that's why I mentioned that waste incinerated for energy or incinerated just burned. Yeah.
So I noted some questions in the chat that are now specific to the data. Brent curious about, so it sounds like you have a separate plastic bag recycling program. So you said you save your plastic bags and send them to specific plastic bag recycling. Should those bags be recorded?
They should be recorded as recycling. Yeah.
Yeah.
But just the ones you use that week.
Great question, and great to hear that you have a program like that. And Beth was curious about the difference between hard plastic packaging versus soft plastic packaging. Is that like a cereal plastic bag versus saran wrap? And it is.
No, it isn't.
No?
A cereal plastic bag, I think like saran wrap is like the stretchy plastic, and a cereal plastic bag is the non-stretchy plastic. But hard plastic, I think, is like a clamshell, like a plastic cup, like a hard plastic cup. So Beth, you are bringing up the fact that there are almost like three kinds. I don't know how it is in all places, but in Toronto, you can recycle the stretchy and not the non-stretchy. So I would call both the cereal bag liner and the saran wrap a soft plastic, and the hard plastic would be like the hard plastic cup or the.
I'm laughing at, I like, Leah has added, so we're all learning as we go. If you can knock on it, it's hard plastic basically is your question. Is that the test that you're using? So there's different levels of it, I guess what we're saying. So yeah, for the purposes of this, and for most plastics, hard would be like those more rigid containers.
Yeah, if you can knock on it, it's hard plastic. Yeah, great.
Depends on how hard you knock on it, I guess. But yeah, so they're all softer, but we'll get more into learning about all of these variations of plastic, what that means for waste management in your own region, which will be very fascinating to learn. I don't see any other questions that I've missed. If I have missed something, please type it again. And if you want to ask a question out loud, you can still raise your hand.
There's a new one just now. How do you record items that you keep to use later? I'm keeping my cat food tins to make metal flour to decorate my garden plot in the summer. Awesome. I would say the ones that you use during that week, well, actually, you are reusing those. So I would not mark them. I would not note them at all. And if, let's say, you weren't yet, and then in week 2 you were then saving them for that, that would be like less items on your list. But you're already, Chris, using garbage to make something, which is awesome. So yeah.
And if you have photos later, we'd love to see what that looks like.
Yeah. Any other questions for clarification or just for fun? Yeah.
Okay. Well, it looks pretty quiet in terms of questions. We have some great story sharing and ideas. So we'll get into all of those. Please hold on and save that information, Chris, to share in the next webinar, because you'll have more of an opportunity to connect with each other on what you've learned and some new tips and ideas that you've come up with. So that'll be a great format for that. So now actually it looks like there's a question. Do we?
Oh yeah. I wouldn't. So if similarly for those, if you're collecting litter from other people, but you're using it to make things, similarly, I think you're reusing that item. So I wouldn't count it as your own garbage. I would really just count things that are going into a landfill bin or into a recycle bin.
Yeah.
Or that will go to landfill or will go to recycling. Because really the overarching goal is to reduce your amount of waste going to landfill, either through recycling or also reducing your amount of recycling also to reduce waste in general. So yeah. So similarly, if you do a beach cleanup, don't count that material during that week. Doesn't get counted as negative, sadly.
No. And Karen, I see your question, but if anyone has other questions that they think of later, remember you can send us an email. And we will actually, Chelsea, if you want to put the next slide up just as we're answering questions, it has all of how to reach out to us. That's if you have questions or more information. Karen, you had asked, we didn't cover it, but you were curious about what a microplastic fragment looks like.
Karen, you can come to our lab and look under the microscope. I don't know. Do we have a picture of microplastics in this deck? Yeah, Karen, send me an email. I saw you today printing, probably tests. But yeah, come on, we'll give you a tour and we'll show you what they look like under a microscope. We have a ton of microplastics in our lab, collected from the Don River and Lake Ontario, and yeah.
So I'll start to wrap up then. We must want to thank you so much for attending this first webinar, which means now it's the start to carry out for your next 2 weeks. You'll officially get started, as Chelsea covered, on the Monday. Again, I've already mentioned this just briefly. If you do have questions, please email us. We do want to see how you're doing. So if you're active on social media and you want to tag us at U of T Trash Team or at our hashtag Home Waste Audit, we'll try to keep an eye out for those. But with that, we'll say goodbye for now. And we really look forward to connecting with you in March. But of course, we also look forward to getting a look at your data. So thanks again, everyone, for coming, and we will wish you good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.